Let's take a few moments to talk about the differences between scarcity and rarity. This is something that White Whale Comics and I touched on in our previous video series, in which we examined the differences between 9.8s and 9.6s. We wanted to go a little bit deeper and to look at what scarcity and rarity actually are, but more importantly, the impact that these two factors can have on comic book prices. We hope that you'll take the time, like in the previous series, to watch both parts of this important examination of scarcity and rarity. Stay tuned. So the first thing that we want to do is to start with a definition of these two factors and then dig a little bit deeper as we improve our understanding of what they actually mean. Scarcity is defined as the state of being scarce or in short supply. In short, it's a shortage. Rarity is defined as the state or quality of being rare. I don't know about you, but as I read and reread those definitions, that didn't really help me. So I continued to do my research and actually found some examples that improved my understanding. My hope is that they'll be helpful for you as well. So as I continued to do my research, what I realized is that scarcity is partially driven by demand, which has, its peaks and its troughs. Whereas rarity is really driven by supply. Either something is rare or it's not. Either you have a lot of it or you have a little of it. There is really no ambiguity when it comes to rarity. So demand is in many ways about perception regarding supply, but it isn't necessarily an accurate assessment of supply. So let's look at an example. Water is scarce, right? Especially if you live in places like California. The demand for water is high, which creates the impression that water is rare, but that simply isn't the case, right? We are not running out of water. We have a ton of water, and in fact, it actually falls from the sky at various points. But because demand for water tends to be high, it creates the perception that it is also rare. But what comes along with that perception of scarcity is higher prices. If you live in the state of California and you try to water your grass, you will be presented with a very large bill because water is scarce, not rare. Let's look at another example. Diamonds are scarce, but not necessarily rare. They are expensive, but there is more than enough diamonds in the world to actually meet the demand. The problem with diamonds comes in from the fact of, do you have enough money to be able to afford that diamond? But diamonds definitely are not something that is rare. They are scarce. Let's contrast diamonds and water to diseases. And it's a strange contrast, but bear with me, right? Diseases can be rare in that there are certain diseases that only affect a few hundred people in the entire world, right? That is a rare disease, a rare condition. But diseases are not scarce because no one is asking for a disease. So that is an example of something that is rare yet not scarce. Hopefully with these examples, you can actually see the differences between scarcity and rarity. They are not the same. They might be similar. People might use the terms interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. There is a distinct difference between scarcity and rarity. So you might be asking, what does any of this have to do with comics? It's actually a really good question. And the reason that I wanted to start with the definitions first is that both scarcity and rarity have an impact on comic book prices, but they impact prices in slightly different ways. And so it's first important to understand, what these things are to understand how they impact comics, but more importantly, how they may negatively or positively impact comics. So bear with me as I continue to break this down. Scarcity is driven by demand, and demand can be influenced by good marketing. Now, what do I mean by that? You see the hot list pop up. You see the videos and the email alerts that say, you know, something is going up in pricing, right? These things inform us, but they also create the perception that there is a tremendous amount of demand for this thing. How many times have you gotten the email that has said, you know, while supplies last, hurry up and get it, time is running out? These are all marketing techniques employed that are designed to create the perception that something is in high demand. And by creating that perception of high demand, you command a higher price for those things. I mean, let's face it, we also kind of create the perception of demand. When we send a message to a friend saying, hey, I'm at the comic book shop and they only have one left, right? There is that pressure to essentially take action now because something is in limited supply. But it's only in limited supply in that particular local comic shop, not necessarily in the entire world, right? So perception creates demand, and that perception can be influenced by lots of things. It can be created and influenced by our friends, but certainly by companies that are sending out emails and, you know, alerts and things like that to actually sell books. So you have to be aware of the reality of the situation. Is this a perception of scarcity, or is this thing actually rare? Now, if I said to you, I have an Amazing Fantasy 15 9.8 for sale, that reality is that Amazing Fantasy is actually rare. There is no misperception about that. That is a rarity. And as such, because it is rare, it will actually command a much higher price. Now, how does this all play out? It all plays out where if the demand and the perception is influenced, then you could potentially buy something at a higher price versus what it's actually worth. And that's why sometimes you see these big ramp ups where something is hot and it becomes really pricey all of a sudden. But that's not real demand. And over time, what ends up happening is that price starts to come back down because the sellers are recognizing that there's no buyers. There is no actual demand, right? The perception created the demand artificially. And it's one of the things that you just want to be aware of. You want to pay attention to what's actually happening in the market to make sure that you are taking the appropriate steps that make sense for you, whether you be a buyer, a seller, a long-term collector. You want to be aware of what's actually happening in the market. Don't get caught up in some of the hype because it could impact you negatively. So as I mentioned, this is a two-part video series in which I am essentially laying the foundation for the differences between scarcity and rarity. And in his video, White Whale Comics is actually going to spend some time in a colorful manner, I assume, of explaining and further highlighting the differences between scarcity and rarity. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I also hope that you take the time to watch part 2 of this video series.